Hello everybody and welcome to Book Badger Books. I'm Book Badger and today we're going to talk about the play Romeo and Juliet by William Shakespeare. So let's get started. Romeo and Juliet is a play that takes place in the beautiful city of Verona, Italy. It's about two rivaling families, the Montagues and the Capulets. These families hate each other so much that they constantly get into fights and sometimes end up killing each other. Act 1, Scene 1 starts with the chorus, which is like a narrator. They introduce where the story takes place and that Romeo and Juliet are two lovers from rival families. The scene starts with two characters, Gregory and Samson, who are servants of the Capulet family. Samson is telling Gregory how he'll pick a fight with any Montague he sees when they see Abram and another servant of Montague's walking down the street toward them. Samson doesn't want to break the law by starting a fight, so he says that he'll bite his thumb to start a reaction. Now, biting a thumb at someone in this time period is a gesture of disrespect. Think of flipping someone off as something similar. As Gregory bites his thumb, Abram notices and confronts Gregory, asking him if he's biting his thumb at him. Basically, are you insulting me? Samson turns to Gregory and asks if the law is on his side. If he answers yes, that he did bite his thumb at Abram and the other servant. Gregory tells him no. So Samson tells Abram and the other servant that he was simply biting his thumb but not at them. Gregory asks Samson if he's trying to start a fight, in which Samson says no, even though he really is. Samson, who seems to be the hothead of the two Capulets, tells Abram and the other servant that if they want to fight he gladly will, and that his employer, Capulet, is a better man than their employer, Montague. This of course angers Abram and the other servant, and they begin to fight. This is when Benvolio, Montague's nephew and Romeo's cousin and friend, approaches. He pulls out his sword and tells the servants to break up the fight. Then Tybalt, a Capulet, who is Juliet's cousin on her mother's side, appears and sees what he thinks is Benvolio fighting with the servants. Tybalt tells Benvolio that he is wasting his time with servants and should fight him instead. Benvolio tells him that he's trying to keep peace and to either put down his sword or help him break up the fight. Tybalt doesn't believe him and tells him that he hates all Montagues and commands him to fight him. As Tybalt and Benvolio fight, a few townspeople gather around, some cheering on the Montagues and some cheering on the Capulets. That's when Capulet, Lady Capulet, Montague, and Lady Montague arrive. Both men, Capulet and Montague, want to fight each other, but their wives hold them back. That's when the prince appears and gives all families and servants involved a lecture about the fighting they've been doing and how it's been disrupting the peace. He tells everyone but Capulet to stay and tells Montague to come see him later that afternoon for their punishments. Once everyone but Montague, Lady Montague, and Benvolio have left, Montague asks Benvolio who started the fight. Benvolio tells him what happened and Lady Montague asks where Romeo is. Benvolio tells her he was taking an early morning walk because he seemed to have a lot on his mind. Montague says he's seen Romeo take a lot of morning walks under a sycamore grove crying, and then Romeo returns home and spends his days in his room with the curtains drawn so that it remains dark inside. Benvolio asks Montague if he asked Romeo what's wrong with him, but Montague says he tried and Romeo won't tell him. Just then, Romeo enters and Benvolio asks Montague and his wife if they'll leave him alone so he can talk to Romeo. Montague agrees, and he and his wife leave. When Romeo approaches, Benvolio asks him why he's so sad lately. Romeo tells him that he's in love with someone who doesn't love him. He then talks about how cruel love is and how it's both opposites at the same time, like heavy and light and bright and dark. Benvolio asks who Romeo is in love with, but he dodges the question at first. Finally, Romeo tells Benvolio that the woman he loves is Rosalind, and she has decided to give her life to the church and refuses to marry. Benvolio tells Romeo to forget about her, and that there are plenty of other beautiful women. Romeo tells him that all women pale in comparison to Rosalind's beauty. Benvolio tells Romeo that he is determined to get Romeo to forget about Rosalind if it's the last thing he does, and they exit together. Act 1, Scene 2 opens with Capulet, County or Count, which means a title of nobility, Paris, and a servant named Peter. County Paris is a kinsman of the prince. Capulet and County Paris are in mid-conversation with Paris, asking to marry Juliet. Capulet is wary because Juliet is only 13 and thinks she's too young to get married. He asks Paris to wait 2 years before asking Juliet to marry him, and during that time he should charm her and get her to love him. He tells Paris that she has to agree to marry him too. Capulet is having an annual feast that night, and he invites Paris to come. He tells him to compare Juliet to other girls there, and decide if he still wants to marry her. Then Capulet turns to Peter, the servant, and tells him to go around Verona and find the people on the guest list to invite them to the feast. Then Capulet and Paris leave Peter alone. Peter is very distraught since he is supposed to find the people on the guest list, but he can't read. Just then Benvolio and Romeo enter, and Peter asks Romeo if he knows how to read. Romeo reads the guest list to Peter, and Rosalind's name appears on it. It's revealed that Rosalind is the niece of Capulet. Romeo asks Peter where the feast is going to happen, and Peter tells him that it will be at Capulet's house. He then says that if they aren't Montagues, they should come to the feast as well. Then Peter leaves to find the people on the guest list. Benvolio tells Romeo that they should go to the feast, since there will be a lot of beautiful women there along with Rosalind. Romeo should compare the beauty of the other women there and see if Rosalind is still prettier than them. Romeo tells him that's impossible and no one could be more beautiful than Rosalind. Romeo decides to go to the feast anyway, but just so he can see Rosalind again. Act 1, Scene 3 starts with 3 women, Lady Capulet, Juliet, her daughter, and the nurse. Juliet's nurse, who is kind of like a nanny to Juliet. They talk about how Juliet will be turning 14 in 2 weeks, and Nurse goes into a speech about how she remembers when Juliet was little and taking care of her. Juliet tells her to stop talking. Then Lady Capulet asks Juliet how she feels about getting married. Juliet tells her that she hasn't really thought about it, and her mother tells her to start thinking about marriage because Paris wants to marry her. Nurse chimes in saying that he's a great man and very handsome. Lady Capulet tells Juliet that Paris will come to the feast that night and that she should study him to see how handsome he is, and that he would make Juliet admired if she married him. Juliet agrees that she'll see if she can like him. Peter, the servant, enters then and tells the ladies that the guests are here. They are asking for Lady Capulet and Juliet, and the nurse is needed in the kitchen. Then they leave to go to the feast. Act 1, Scene 4 starts with Romeo, Benvolio, and Mercutio, who is a kinsman to the prince and Romeo's close friend, as they sneak into the Capulet feast with 5 or 6 other maskers carrying drums and torches. Maskers are like partygoers who perform a dance they invented at a party. Romeo asks if they should invent an excuse as to why they are at the feast, but Benvolio says it's out of fashion to give lengthy explanations. They can judge them however they want. They'll simply show up, give the Capulets a dance, and then leave. Romeo mentions that he wants to be one of the torchbearers who hold a torch so that he won't have to dance, saying that he is too sad to dance. Mercutio tells him no, and that he has to dance. Before entering the feast, Romeo, Benvolio, and Mercutio all put on their masks. On their way in, Mercutio talks about Queen Mab, who is the fairy's midwife. Queen Mab rides through the brains of lovers and makes them dream about love. He goes on for quite a bit until Romeo tells him to be quiet and that he's talking nonsense. Romeo mentions that he has a feeling that the feast that night will be the start of something bad and will end in his own death. But he shrugs it off by saying that whoever is in charge of his life can lead him where they want, and they all go inside. Act 1, Scene 5 starts with Peter and other serving men rushing around taking care of the feast. Capulet, Lady Capulet, Tybalt, Capulet's cousin, Juliet, and other members of Capulet meet the maskers, including Romeo and his crew. Capulet makes a welcome speech and sits down with his cousin to talk about when they used to wear masks at parties when they were younger. Off to the side, Romeo asks a serving man who the girl next to a knight is, and he replies that he doesn't know. Romeo then proceeds to talk to himself about how beautiful Juliet is, and Tybalt overhears him. He recognizes him as a Montague and orders his page to bring him his sword. He sees Romeo's appearance as an insult and doesn't see it as a crime to kill Romeo to protect his family's honor. Capulet asks him why he's so angry. Tybalt explains that there's a Montague at the party to mock them, and Capulet asks if it's Romeo. Tybalt says that it is, and Capulet tells Tybalt to calm down and leave Romeo alone. He then tells Tybalt to smile and behave himself, since that's how he should behave at a feast. Tybalt refuses and says that he won't tolerate Romeo being there. Capulet immediately becomes upset and challenges Tybalt, saying that he will tolerate Romeo, and he is the boss of Tybalt. He will not have Tybalt causing a riot among his guests. Tybalt argues that Romeo is disrespecting them, but Capulet tells Tybalt to leave and that he is being idiotic and childish. Fuming, Tybalt leaves, vowing to get revenge on Romeo for his prank. We cut to Romeo, who has caught up with Juliet and takes her hand. Romeo mentions how rough his own hand is, but he would make up for it with a kiss. Juliet tells him that he doesn't give his hand enough credit, and Romeo asks her if he can kiss her. She agrees and they happily kiss. They flirt some more and then kiss again. That's when the nurse steps in and mentions that Juliet's mother wants to talk to her. Once Juliet is gone, Romeo asks the nurse who her mother is, and she answers that it's Lady Capulet. Romeo is distraught when he realizes that Juliet is the daughter of his family's enemy. Benvolio comes up next to Romeo and tells him it's time to go. Everyone but the nurse and Juliet leave. Juliet asks the nurse who the man was she was talking to. The nurse says that she doesn't know, and Juliet tells her to go ask. After asking, the nurse comes back and says that he is Romeo, the only son of her worst enemy. Juliet is upset that the man that she now loves is the one she grew up to hate, and calls love a monster. As the party winds down, the nurse tells Juliet that they should retire to bed. Act 2 begins with the chorus again, basically summing up Act 1 by saying that Romeo and Juliet love each other, but both don't have much opportunity to tell each other this, thereby making it dangerous for them to be together. The extreme danger sweetens the intense pleasure. Romeo jumps over the orchard wall into the Capulet property because he has second thoughts about leaving behind Juliet. Benvolio and Mercutio enter looking around for Romeo as they have lost him. They call for Romeo, and Mercutio says that he saw Romeo jump over the orchard wall. Mercutio mentions Rosalind to lure Romeo out of his hiding place because he still thinks Romeo is in love with her. They decide to give up looking for Romeo, thinking that he's still brooding over Rosalind. Act 2, Scene 2 starts with Romeo underneath Juliet's balcony. Juliet comes out onto the balcony, and Romeo remarks on how beautiful she is, and how he wishes he could be near her. Juliet starts talking, but she thinks she is talking to herself, and doesn't know that Romeo is down below. Juliet laments that Romeo is a Montague, and wishes he would change his name, or that if he loves her, that she would change her name. Romeo isn't sure if he should start talking or just listen. Juliet goes on to say that the name isn't important and shouldn't matter. If a rose were called anything else, it would smell as sweet, and Romeo would still be himself if he wasn't called a Montague. This is when Romeo speaks up and says that he will change his name if Juliet calls him her own. Juliet, who was startled, asks who he is and why he's listening. He tells her he doesn't know what name to give her because his name is an enemy, and that he'd tear it up if he could. This is when Juliet recognizes his name and realizes it's Romeo talking to her. She asks Romeo how he got into their property and why he came since the orchard walls are so tall. She also tells him that any of her relatives will kill him if they find Romeo there. He tells her that he flew over the walls on the wings of love, and that stone walls and relatives can't keep out love. Juliet again tells Romeo that if her relatives see him, they'll murder him. Romeo tells her that an angry look from her would be worse than to be murdered. He also mentions that the darkness would hide him away. Juliet then asks Romeo how he knew to go into her bedroom, and he tells her that love showed him the way, and that he would risk anything to get Juliet. Juliet mentions that she's glad it's dark out so that Romeo won't see her blushing about the things she said when she thought she was alone. Then she asks Romeo if he loves her and tells him that she loves him. She wouldn't have told him so openly, but he already heard her thoughts from before. Romeo starts to swear that he loves her by the moon, but she tells him not to because the moon is always changing, and she doesn't want him to be inconsistent like that. Then Juliet tells Romeo not to swear by anything, and maybe they were too quick to say they loved each other. She tells him good night, and she hopes their love, which is a bud now, will bloom into a flower the next time they meet. Romeo asks her if she's going to leave him so unsatisfied, and Juliet asks him what could make him satisfied that night. He tells her that he'd be satisfied if they made true promises of love. She says she already pledged her love to him. Suddenly, the nurse calls for Juliet and she tells Romeo to wait there for a minute while she leaves. Juliet comes back and tells Romeo that if he really loves her and wants to marry her, that he'll send her word tomorrow. She'll send him a messenger and Romeo can tell her where and when they can be married. But if he doesn't have honorable intentions, then she wants Romeo to leave her alone. Juliet leaves again as the nurse calls her, but then Juliet appears and whispers to Romeo asking what time she should send the messenger. He tells her 9 o'clock and she says that waiting from now until then will seem like 20 years. She tells him good night and that parting is such sweet sorrow until tonight becomes tomorrow. Romeo wishes her good night and that he will go see his priest to tell him what has happened and to ask for help. Act 2, Scene 3 begins with Friar Lawrence walking in with a basket as he collects both poisonous weeds and medicinal flowers. Romeo walks in and Friar Lawrence asks him why he is there so early to see him. Romeo tells him that he's fallen in love with his enemy, Capulet's daughter, and she has fallen in love with him. He asks Friar Lawrence to marry them that day. Friar Lawrence remarks that this is a drastic change since only a day ago Romeo was in love with Rosalind. Friar Lawrence scolds Romeo for being obsessed with Rosalind and then changing his mind so quickly. Romeo mentions that Rosalind didn't love him and Juliet does. Friar Lawrence agrees to marry Romeo and Juliet with the hopes that it will turn the hatred of their families into love. Act 2, Scene 4 starts with Mercutio and Benvolio who are looking for Romeo since he didn't come home the night before. Benvolio mentions that Tybalt, Capulet's cousin, sent a letter to Romeo's father, and they surmise that it's probably a challenge. They worry whether Romeo can accept the challenge or not, since they still believe that Romeo is still getting over Rosalind. Mercutio tells Benvolio about what a master swordsman Tybalt is. Romeo enters and Mercutio tells him that he left them without telling them. Romeo tells them that he had important business, though he was sorry he didn't tell them he was leaving. Mercutio and Romeo then joke and banter while Benvolio tells them he's had enough of their jokes. Just then, the nurse enters with her servant, Peter. The nurse asks if any of the men have seen Romeo, and Romeo says who he is. She says that she would like to talk to him. Benvolio and Mercutio leave to have lunch with Romeo's father, and Romeo tells them that he'll catch up with them later. The nurse tells Romeo that Juliet asked her to come find him. The nurse tells Romeo that he better not hurt her or lead her on, but she can see he has a good heart. Romeo tells the nurse for Juliet to devise a plan to get out of her house and meet him at the Abbey and to find Friar Lawrence. Then they'll be married. Romeo gives the nurse money for her troubles. Romeo then tells her that within an hour he'll have one of his men waiting at the Abbey to give the nurse a rope ladder to climb over the walls at night. But before leaving, the nurse tells Romeo about Paris and how he wants to marry Juliet as well, but that Juliet isn't interested in him. Then they part ways to get ready. Act 2, Scene 5 opens with Juliet who is anxious because the nurse hasn't come back yet. The nurse enters and Juliet is overjoyed. Juliet pesters the nurse for news of what Romeo said, and the nurse tells her to give her a minute while she rests from walking all over the city trying to find Romeo. The nurse then tells Juliet that Romeo still wants to marry her, and to go to Friar Lawrence during confessions and they will be married. Juliet tells the nurse to wish her good luck. Act 2, Scene 6 starts with Friar Lawrence and Romeo. Friar Lawrence tells Romeo to love in moderation so their love doesn't burn out too quickly. Juliet enters and Friar Lawrence tells them to come with him since he won't leave them alone until they're married. Act 3, Scene 1 begins with Mercutio, his page, Benvolio, and a few other men. Benvolio is asking Mercutio to call it a day since it's so hot out, and heat can make people even more hot-headed. Mercutio replies that Benvolio is the more hot-headed one and will pick a fight over the dumbest things. Just then Tybalt, Petruchio, and other Capulets arrive. Tybalt steps forward and tells the Montagues that he would like to have a word with them. Tybalt says to Mercutio that he hangs out with Romeo, but then Romeo enters and Tybalt tells Mercutio never mind because here's the man he's been looking for. Tybalt calls Romeo a villain, but because Romeo has just married Juliet, he's so happy that he tells Tybalt that he should have cause to love Tybalt. This may be because they are now officially family. Romeo tells Tybalt that he will excuse his insult. Tybalt says that Romeo's words can't excuse the harm he's done to him, namely, the embarrassment Romeo caused when Capulet lectured Tybalt at the party for wanting to fight Romeo. Romeo tells Tybalt that he has done no harm and that he still loves him. Mercutio doesn't like this response and tells Romeo that his submission is dishonorable. Mercutio says that he will fight Tybalt instead. At first, Tybalt won't fight Mercutio since he is after Romeo, but when Mercutio insults him, Tybalt agrees to fight. Romeo tells Benvolio to pull out his sword so they can break up the fight. Romeo tries to break it up by telling them that the prince has ordered them not to fight in public. Tybalt reaches under Romeo's arm as he tries to break it up and stabs Mercutio. Petruchio tells Tybalt that they should leave, and the Capulets leave. Mercutio orders his page to get a doctor. Romeo tells Mercutio that the wound can't be that bad, but Mercutio tells him that it's bad enough to kill him. He then asks Romeo why he came between them since Tybalt struck Mercutio under Romeo's arm. Romeo tells him he thought it was the right thing to do. Mercutio tells Benvolio to take him into a house and they both leave. Romeo laments what happened, only for Benvolio to return and tell him that Mercutio is dead. Romeo says that the future will be affected by what just happened. Just then, Tybalt comes back. Romeo is furious and says to forget mercy and consideration, and he will let rage guide his actions. Romeo fights Tybalt, and Romeo kills him. Benvolio tells him to get out of there because civilians are gathering around, and the prince will give him the death penalty if he gets caught. Romeo leaves, and a citizen of the watch, who are like the city guards or constables, enter. He asks where Tybalt went, and Benvolio points to where Tybalt is slumped over. The prince enters then with Montague, Lady Montague, Capulet, Lady Capulet, and others. The prince demands where the evil men are who started the fight. Benvolio tells him that he will tell him everything that happened. Benvolio tells the prince all that happened and how Tybalt started the fight. Lady Capulet says that he is a Montague and he's lying. She's also grieving because Tybalt was her cousin. Because Romeo killed Tybalt, he must be punished. But because he killed Tybalt because Tybalt killed Mercutio, Romeo won't be killed but exiled from Verona. Mercutio also was a close personal friend of the prince's, and he isn't too happy with the Capulets right now. The prince tells Benvolio to tell Romeo to leave the city, and if he is found in Verona, he will be executed. Act 3, Scene 2 starts with Juliet as she sits around anxiously waiting for the sun to go down so that Romeo can visit her in the night. The nurse comes in with the rope ladder Romeo told her to get, and Juliet asks why the nurse looks so sad. The nurse tells Juliet that he's dead, and Juliet mistakenly thinks she's talking about Romeo. The nurse goes on to talk about Tybalt and how his sight of blood made her faint. Juliet still thinks she's talking about Romeo until the nurse mentions Tybalt's name. Juliet, who is confused, asks if both Romeo and Tybalt are dead. That's when the nurse snaps out of her despair to tell Juliet that Romeo killed Tybalt, Juliet's cousin. Juliet can't believe that Romeo would do such a thing, and the nurse tells her that all men cheat and lie, and that they're all wicked. The nurse says shame on Romeo, and Juliet immediately scolds her not to say that, and that she's sorry she was ever angry with Romeo. Juliet struggles with her feelings as she feels both sad that her cousin Tybalt died, but happy and relieved that Romeo isn't dead. She wants to cry, but out of happiness that Romeo isn't dead, but she feels guilty because she should be crying for her cousin. Juliet is anguished because Romeo is banished. Juliet asks where her parents are, and the nurse tells her that they're crying over Tybalt's corpse. Juliet says that she will lie in her bed depressed since Romeo can't be with her. The nurse tells her that she'll go get Romeo and tell him to come to Juliet that night. Juliet gives her ring to the nurse to give to Romeo, and to tell him to come to her to give his last goodbye. Act 3, Scene 3 starts with Friar Lawrence and Romeo as Romeo asks what the news is and what punishments has the prince ruled. Friar Lawrence tells Romeo that he is banished from Verona, and Romeo tells him that that's worse than execution since Verona is where Juliet lives. Friar Lawrence tries to talk about Romeo's situation, but Romeo won't hear it because he is too wrapped up in sorrow. Suddenly, someone knocks on the door, and Friar Lawrence tells Romeo to go hide. The nurse enters, asking where Romeo is. Friar Lawrence says he's grieving on the floor, and the nurse tells the friar that he's acting just like Juliet. Romeo looks at her and asks how Juliet is. She tells him Juliet keeps crying about Romeo and about Tybalt. Romeo laments that he caused Juliet pain, and Friar Lawrence lectures him that he isn't seeing the good things in front of him, like how talented he is, the fact that Juliet is alive, and the fact that instead of being sentenced to death for killing Tybalt, Romeo is only exiled. Friar Lawrence then tells Romeo to go see Juliet and comfort her until the night watchmen, or city guards, come. Then he tells Romeo to go to the city of Mantua, where he can live until they make his and Juliet's marriage public. Once there is a peace between the families, they will ask the prince to pardon Romeo. Then they'll welcome Romeo back happily. Then Friar Lawrence tells the nurse to go tell Juliet to get everybody in her house to bed because Romeo is coming. The nurse says that she will, and she gives Romeo the ring that Juliet gave him. Romeo tells her that this makes him feel so much better. Friar Lawrence tells Romeo to get going and to make his way to Mantua. While there, Friar Lawrence will deliver updates about Romeo's case through Romeo's servant. Romeo leaves to go visit Juliet. So Act 3, Scene 4 begins with Capulet, Lady Capulet, and Paris. Capulet tells Paris that he's sorry they haven't had time to convince Juliet to marry him because of the mourning over Tybalt. Paris tells him that times of pain are not time for romance. Capulet and Lady Capulet tell Paris they will convince Juliet to marry him that Thursday, 3 days from then. Because Tybalt just died, and they don't want people to think they aren't grieving properly for Tybalt, they will have a small wedding. Capulet tells his wife to get Juliet ready to marry Paris, and they all say goodnight. Act 3, Scene 5 begins with Romeo and Juliet. The sun is starting to come out, and Romeo tells Juliet that he has to leave or he will be killed. Juliet tells him that it isn't morning yet, and he still has time to be with her. Romeo tells her he'll stay and be killed if that's what she wants, but she tells him that she's wrong, it is morning, and he needs to leave. Just then, the nurse walks in and tells Juliet that her mother is coming in to see her. The nurse leaves, and Romeo tells Juliet to give him one kiss and he'll leave. They kiss and he climbs down the ladder. Juliet asks if they'll see each other again, and Romeo tells her that he has no doubts. Lady Capulet calls from outside Juliet's bedroom and asks if she's awake. Juliet wonders to herself why her mother is calling her at such an early hour. Lady Capulet enters and asks Juliet what's wrong. Juliet tells her that she isn't feeling well, and Lady Capulet thinks she's talking about her cousin, Tybalt. Her mother tells her that she's not crying for Tybalt, but because the man who killed him is still alive. Lady Capulet tells Juliet not to worry because they're going to send a man to Mantua where Romeo has been exiled. There he will poison Romeo's drink and join Tybalt in death. Juliet tells her that if she can find a man to deliver the poison, Juliet will mix the drink herself. Lady Capulet tells her that she'll find the right man. Then Lady Capulet tells Juliet that she has good news for her. She tells her that she will marry Paris that Thursday morning. Juliet tells her that it is too soon and Paris hasn't even courted her yet. Then she tells her that she would rather marry Romeo, who her mother thinks she hates, rather than Paris. Her father and the nurse walk in. Her father, seeing that she's still crying, asks if she's going to cry forever. Then he asks his wife if Juliet agrees to the marriage. She tells him no. Capulet is stunned and says that Juliet should be grateful they found a man she is not worthy of. Juliet tells him that she's proud that they found her such a match, but that she doesn't want it. Capulet turns angry and tells her that she will marry Paris that Thursday, even if he has to drag her there. Juliet pleads with her father to listen to her, but he's too upset. He turns to his wife and says that they never should have had Juliet to begin with. The nurse sticks up for Juliet, saying that Capulet's being too harsh on her. Capulet tells her to shut up and go gossip with her friends. The nurse tells him she has said nothing wrong, and Capulet tells her to be quiet again. Lady Capulet tells him he's getting too angry, and he tells her it makes him mad that all his energy is spent to finding Juliet a good husband, and now he has, but she doesn't want him. Then he turns to Juliet and tells her that if she acts like his daughter, she can marry his friend. If she doesn't, then she can beg, starve, and die in the streets. Then he leaves. Juliet turns to her mother and asks her to delay the wedding a month or even a week, but her mother says she's done worrying about her and also leaves. Juliet turns to her nurse and asks her what to do to stop this, since she's already married to Romeo. The nurse tells her that Romeo is banished and can never come back except in secret. She says the best thing to do is to marry Paris. She says that Juliet would be happy in this second marriage, and even if Romeo makes a better husband, it's better to have a husband who she can be with. Juliet asks if she speaks from her heart, and her nurse tells her from her heart and her soul. Juliet lies and says that her words have given her comfort. She tells her nurse to go tell her mother that she made her father angry, and she's going to go to Friar Lawrence to confess and be forgiven. Her nurse tells her that she will, and she leaves. Once the nurse is gone, Juliet curses her because she wants Juliet to break her marriage vows, especially when she praised Romeo so well. From now on, she will not trust her nurse with anything, and if all else fails, at least she has the power to take her own life. Act 4, Scene 1 starts with Friar Lawrence talking to Paris about marrying Juliet. Friar Lawrence remarks that Thursday is very soon. Friar Lawrence says that not knowing what Juliet thinks about it is a rocky road, but Paris tells him that romantic love doesn't happen when people are grieving. Capulet thinks it's dangerous for her to be by herself, so sad, and that if she had someone to comfort her, she would stop crying. That is the reason for the marriage rush. Friar Lawrence says to himself that he wished he didn't know the reason why the marriage should be slowed, meaning that he knows that Juliet is married to Romeo, and she shouldn't be marrying Paris. Just then, Juliet walks in, and Paris says that he's happy to meet her and calls her his wife. She says that he shouldn't be calling her that unless they were married. Paris tells her that when she confesses to Friar Lawrence to also confess that she loves him. Juliet skirts around directly telling Paris that she doesn't love him and asks Friar Lawrence if he has time for her or if she should come back for evening mass. Friar Lawrence says he has time for her, and Paris kisses Juliet and leaves. Juliet immediately falls into despair once he leaves, and Friar Lawrence tells her that he already knows about her situation. Juliet tells him that if he can't prevent marrying Paris, then at least tell her that her only solution is wise, and she pulls out a knife. She says before she marries another man, she'll end herself. She tells him to either give her a solution or watch. Friar Lawrence tells her that he has a risky solution, but since she's willing to end her life, he doesn't see any other way. Friar Lawrence tells her to go home and be cheerful and say that she will marry Paris. Then, on Wednesday night, make sure she is alone. Then he pulls out a vial and tells her to mix it with liquor and drink it. It will seem like she's dead for 42 hours, and she won't be able to move. Then she'll wake up as if from a pleasant sleep. Once everyone thinks she's dead, they'll put her in an open coffin and carry her to the Capulet family tomb. While this is going on, Friar Lawrence will send a message to Romeo laying out the plan. Romeo will go to her tomb, wake her up, and both will run away to Mantua together. Juliet accepts the vial eagerly, and Friar Lawrence says that he will send a friar quickly to Romeo with the message. Juliet says that love will give her strength, and she leaves. Act 4, Scene 2 begins with Capulet, Lady Capulet, the nurse, and 2 or 3 serving men. Capulet sends the serving men with different errands to get ready for the wedding. Capulet asks the nurse if Juliet's gone to see Friar Lawrence, and she tells him she did. Juliet enters and tells her father that she sinned by disobeying him. She kneels down and begs for forgiveness. Capulet approves and says that the city owes the friar a great debt for changing Juliet's mind. Juliet asks the nurse to help her pick out the right dress and jewelry for the wedding. Capulet is so thrilled that he says they'll have the wedding the next morning. Juliet and the nurse leave. Lady Juliet says the supplies will be short for the party, but her husband tells her that everything will be alright and to go get Juliet ready. Capulet decides to go tell Paris the news of changing the wedding from Thursday to tomorrow, and mentions how happy he is to have his daughter back. Act 4, Scene 3 starts with Juliet and the nurse as they look through Juliet's dresses. They decide on the best clothes, and Juliet tells the nurse to leave her alone that night so she can pray for blessings for the wedding. Lady Capulet walks in and asks if they need any help. Juliet tells her they have everything ready and to leave her alone to rest. The nurse can help Lady Capulet with all the festivities to prepare. Lady Capulet tells Juliet to give her rest, and both she and the nurse leave. Being left alone, Juliet starts to fear because of what she has to do, and almost calls the nurse back, but the plan wouldn't work. She needs to do this alone. Juliet looks at the vial and wonders if there will be air in the tomb, or if she wakes up before Romeo gets there and she'll be surrounded in darkness by her dead ancestors. She thinks of Romeo and says she drinks to him. Then she drinks the vial and lies down on her bed. Act 4, Scene 4 begins with Lady Capulet and the nurse as they get things ready. Capulet enters, and Lady Capulet and the nurse tell him to go to bed since he'll be sick the next day if he stays up all night. They leave, but Capulet ignores them as he continues to delegate chores to different serving men. Before long, the sun comes up, and Capulet calls to the nurse. She enters, and he tells her to go wake up Juliet. Act 4, Scene 5 starts with the nurse as she enters Juliet's room to wake her up. The nurse tries to wake up Juliet, but she doesn't stir. The nurse pulls back the curtains around the bed and sees that Juliet is still in all her clothes. She calls for help, and Lady Capulet enters asking what the trouble is. The nurse tells her to look at Juliet, and her mother looks to see that Juliet appears dead. Lady Capulet calls for help, and her husband comes in. Capulet tells them shame on Juliet for keeping Paris waiting, and both the nurse and Lady Capulet tell him that Juliet is dead. Capulet looks and sees that she's cold and her body is frigid. They all lament over Juliet as Friar Lawrence, Paris, and the musicians enter. Friar Lawrence asks if Juliet is ready to go to church, and Capulet says that she is, but she won't ever return. Then he looks at Paris and says that death has taken his wife. They all lament and curse death for taking Juliet, and Friar Lawrence tells them to be quiet since they had Juliet with the help of heaven, and now heaven has her. He tells them she is in a better place and will have eternal life. Then he instructs them to put Rosemary on her corpse and put her in her best clothes. It's natural to cry for her, but they should be happy for her. Capulet says that everything they planned for a wedding will now be used for a funeral, and that everything they planned will be used for the opposite purpose. Friar Lawrence tells everyone to prepare for the funeral and not to anger the heavens further, for they have already angered the heavens for some past sin. After everyone leaves but the musicians and the nurse tells them to put their instruments away and then leaves. Peter the servant enters and tells the musicians to play him a song of comfort. They tell him they won't, and Peter becomes upset and tells them to play and sing. Then Peter leaves, and the musicians say they'll wait for the mourners and stay for dinner. Act 5, Scene 1 begins with Romeo as he eagerly awaits for news from Verona. His servant Balthazar enters, and Romeo asks for news of Juliet. He tells him that Juliet is dead and lies in Capulet's tomb. Romeo tells his servant that he's going to leave for Verona that night, and Balthazar tells him not to rush because he doesn't look well. He tells him he's wrong and to do what he's told. Once Balthazar leaves, Romeo says to himself that he will lie with Juliet that night, and he remembers a pharmacist who lives nearby. The man looked poor, and even though it's against the law in Mantua, he will probably be desperate enough to sell some poison to Romeo. Romeo goes to the pharmacist, and he tells him that he will pay him if he gives him some fast-working poison. The pharmacist tells him that it's against the law to sell poison, but Romeo points out how frail and skinny he is and that he's probably starving. Anyone can see that he's a beggar, and again Romeo offers him the money. The pharmacist agrees, not because he wants to, but because he's poor. Romeo gives him the money and says that money is more poisonous to men than poison is. Then they part ways. Act 5, Scene 2 begins with Friar Lawrence and Friar John, the friar who was supposed to give the letter to Romeo about the plan of Juliet's. Friar Lawrence asks Friar John what Romeo said about the letter, but Friar John says that he asked another friar to join him to Mantua. On the way there, they traveled by a house that was hit with the plague. The town health officials thought they had been to that house and quarantined it, and wouldn't let them out. He couldn't go to Mantua because he was stuck there. Friar Lawrence asked who took the letter to Romeo, but Friar John said he couldn't get anybody to send the letter since they were scared of spreading the plague. Friar Lawrence tells Friar John to go get his crowbar and bring it to him. Once Friar John is gone, Friar Lawrence says to himself that he must go open the Capulet tomb since Romeo won't be there to do it and Juliet will be all alone. Act 5, Scene 3 opens with Paris and his page as they enter the graveyard. Paris tells him to be a lookout to make sure no one comes into the graveyard. He tells him to whistle if someone is coming. Paris takes a torch and some flowers and scatters the flowers on Juliet's closed tomb. He talks about how he will visit Juliet's grave every night while his page whistles as someone is approaching. Paris hides as Romeo and Balthazar enter with a torch, a pickaxe, and a crowbar. Romeo tells Balthazar to deliver a letter to his father. Then he tells him to swear on his life that whatever he hears or sees, not to interrupt him. Balthazar tells him that he won't interrupt, and Romeo tells him he's being a good friend. Then he gives Balthazar money and tells him to go and live a happy life. Balthazar is worried about Romeo and decides to hide nearby instead of leave. Then he falls asleep. As Romeo works to open the tomb, Paris thinks to himself that Romeo is there to commit awful crimes against the dead bodies of Tybalt and Juliet, and that he'll catch him. Paris tells Romeo to stop what he's doing and that he must die. Romeo agrees that he must die, and that's why he came there. He tells Paris not to mess with someone who's desperate and not to make him angry. He doesn't want to kill anyone else. Paris refuses to leave and says that he's going to arrest Romeo. Romeo asks if Paris is trying to provoke him, and then says he will fight him. As Romeo and Paris fight, Paris's page sees this and runs to go get the watchman. As Paris lays dying, he asks Romeo to bury him next to Juliet. Romeo then takes a closer look at Paris as he lays dead and realizes that it's Mercutio's relative, Count Paris. Romeo remembers that Mercutio had said Paris was planning to marry Juliet. Romeo laments that both he and Paris have such bad luck and that he will bury him in a magnificent grave. Romeo opens the tomb and lays Paris in it, saying that a dead man is burying him. Romeo lies next to Juliet, remarking how beautiful she is still, and kisses her. Then he drinks the poison and dies. Out of the tomb, Friar Lawrence enters the graveyard when Balthazar approaches him. He tells him that he is a friend and that his master is in the tomb. Friar Lawrence asks who his master is, and he answers Romeo. Friar Lawrence asks how long he's been there, and Balthazar tells him a whole hour. Friar Lawrence goes into the tomb to see a bloody Paris and a pale Romeo. Just then, Juliet starts to wake up. Juliet wakes up and sees Friar Lawrence standing there. She asks where her husband Romeo is. Friar Lawrence tells her that Romeo and also Paris lie dead next to her. He tells her to come with him and she can join the Sisterhood of Holy Nuns. He says she has to hurry and not to ask questions because the watchmen are coming. Juliet tells him to get out of there and leave her alone. He leaves and Juliet sees that Romeo drank a cup of poison, remarking how rude it was for him not to leave her any. The watchman and Paris's page enter the graveyard and Juliet hears them coming. Juliet sees Romeo's dagger next to her and says that she must be quick. She stabs herself with Romeo's dagger and then dies. From outside, Paris's page leads the group to the tomb. The chief watchman says the ground is bloody and sends some of his men to search the graveyard and bring anybody they find. The chief watchman remarks at how Paris, Juliet, and Romeo are all dead. He tells other watchmen to go tell the prince, wake up the Capulets, and wake up the Montagues. Watchmen bring Balthazar and then Friar Lawrence to the tomb. The prince enters and asks why crime has happened so early in the morning. Capulet and Lady Capulet enter, and they all ask the chief watchman what has happened. The chief watchman tells them that Paris, Romeo, and Juliet all lie dead in the tomb, with Juliet bleeding and her body still warm even though she supposedly died the day before. Capulet and Lady Capulet grieve over seeing Romeo's dagger in her heart. Montague enters, mentioning that his wife died last night because of Romeo's exile, and asks what more pain he has to endure. He sees his son's body in the tomb and cries that it isn't right for a son to die before his father. The prince tells them all to be quiet until they can get to the bottom of this. Friar Lawrence then steps forward and explains everything that happened. Then Balthazar is summoned forward and explains how Romeo rode with him out of Mantua. He mentions that Romeo gave him a letter to give to his father, and the prince demands to see the letter. Then the prince tells Paris's page to come and tell him why they were there. The page tells him that they were there for Paris to put flowers on Juliet's tomb. Then someone came to the tomb and they began to fight. That's when the page ran away to go get the watchman. The prince looks over the letter Romeo wrote to his father, and it confirms what Friar Lawrence had said. Then the prince turns to the Capulets and the Montagues. He tells them to see what their feud and hatred has caused, and how everyone has now suffered for it. Montague says that he will build a statue of Juliet in pure gold that will be marveled by all in Verona, and she will be praised. Capulet says that he will build a statue of Romeo to lie beside Juliet, as they were poor sacrifices for their rivalry. The prince says they settle a dark peace that morning and to come talk more about what their plans are. Some involved will be punished and some will be pardoned, but there was never a story more full of pain than the story of Romeo and Juliet. One of the big questions that is asked is, were Romeo and Juliet actually in love? One thing we should make clear is that Shakespeare only ever wrote two kinds of plays, comedies and tragedies. Basically, the comedies had happy endings while the tragedies have, well, tragic endings. Having that out of the way, it's important to note that Romeo and Juliet was not a love story but a tragedy, and here's why. In the beginning of the play, Romeo is moping around and depressed because the woman he supposedly loves, Rosalind, has decided to become a nun, essentially, and therefore refuses to get married. Since Romeo wants to marry her, he is devastated. But then at the Capulet party, all it takes is one look at Juliet to make him forget about Rosalind and focus solely on Juliet. So, is this love at first sight, or is it attraction at first sight? If it was love at first sight, then what did Shakespeare accomplish by introducing Romeo as in love with Rosalind? I believe he did this to show that Romeo was indeed attracted to and liked Rosalind, but because this was so fleeting and so quickly replaced with his attraction to Juliet the instant he saw her, this does not indicate that Romeo was in love with Rosalind. It shows that he is prone to obsess and claim he is in love when really he is too rash and changes his mind too quickly. Friar Lawrence even says that he is shocked at the turn of events that Romeo is coming to tell him of his love of Juliet instead of Rosalind. The main reason for Friar Lawrence to marry Romeo and Juliet is that he hopes this will create a peace between their rivaling families and will stop their bloodshed. In truth, Romeo and Juliet knew each other not even a full day before deciding to get married. We know that this is not common because when Paris came to Capulet asking for Juliet's hand in marriage, Capulet is surprised and tells Paris to court Juliet for a while and then marry her when she is older. Romeo and Juliet were young, passionate, romantic, and dramatic, with going so far as to end themselves to join each other in death, even with knowing each other only one day. Shows how immature and unrealistic they were. Maybe their infatuation at first sight could have turned to love, but since they both ended their lives too quickly, we'll never know. While Romeo and Juliet certainly were responsible for their own consequences, they weren't the only ones guilty of them. Both the nurse and Friar Lawrence were pivotal players in the decisions and the outcomes of Romeo and Juliet. The nurse was the only one Juliet confided in as to what was happening with herself and Romeo. Only the nurse knew that Juliet was in love with Romeo on the Capulet side. Not only this, but Juliet sent her nurse to go out to find Romeo and tell him Juliet wants to marry him. The nurse also got a rope ladder for Romeo to climb into Juliet's bedroom. Friar Lawrence was just as to blame for their marriage. He arranged it so that Romeo and Juliet could come to him in secret so they could get married. Like the nurse, he also kept their love affair a secret. The only difference between the nurse and Friar Lawrence are the reasons behind helping Juliet and Romeo. The nurse helped Juliet be with Romeo only as long as it was in Juliet's best interest, or rather, as long as the nurse thought it was in her best interest. Once Romeo was banished and Juliet was faced with marrying a handsome, ready, and present man, Paris, her nurse immediately changes tact. She encourages Juliet to marry Paris instead. It seems that the nurse is driven by what she believes is best for Juliet. While it's no doubt that Friar Lawrence cares for Romeo, his reasons for helping Romeo seem to be also for the future peace of the rivaling families in Verona. This, however, changes when Juliet comes to him and threatens to either give her a solution to being forced to marry Paris, or she will end her life. Because Friar Lawrence devises the plan to join Juliet with Romeo, we see that his drive behind helping them is more about what they want rather than what is best for them. Friar Lawrence's initial intentions were good, but it created a situation where each character was backed into a drastic corner. In the end, both the nurse and Friar Lawrence had good intentions, but without the help of both, there is a good chance that the play would not have ended how it did. Either way, it's a tragic ending, and all the characters had a part to play in leading to it. Thank you guys for watching. I know it was a long one. Let me know if there are any other books or plays you'd like me to review. This was a crazy long read, and a humongous thanks goes to No Fear Shakespeare, because there is no way I would have understood half the things Shakespeare was talking about. It was interesting to read, and I hope you think so too. Also, plug in here, but I wrote a book of my own called Welcome to Bakersfield. It'll be coming out soon, so I'll keep you all posted if you want to give that a read as well. Anyway, I'll see you later as I review another book or play next time.